Fantastic. Thanks, Jonathan, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me today on this webinar. It's a bit gloomy today, but luckily we are inside, and I'm going to be using menti.com as we go along for a few sort of quizzes, polls. So if you've got another device handy, log into or just open up a browser, type in menti.com, and it will just ask you for a code 61078478. And you'll be able to just participate along as we go. I'll share that again, but menti.com 61078478. So what we're going to be covering today, well, I'm going to touch on what is carbon and how we categorize it, how Severn Trent started their Scope 3 journey, what we found, our sources and our findings, and then some of the key challenges and some of our future plans. Okay. But firstly, so who's Severn Trent and how do we fit in here? So I'm sure most of you are familiar. Severn Trent is a water and waste services company that serves about 8 million customers in the Midlands region, just highlighted in blue there. And the environment is really at the heart of Severn Trent. Taking care of one of life's essentials is one of our strap lines, and it's something that we're all really passionate about, and Severn Trent has put a lot of focus into tackling. I'm Sam Berry. As Jonathan kindly introduced me, I'm a project manager on our Scope 3 programme, and I've been working in our carbon programme for a couple of years now. I also was at the Commonwealth Games where we participated with some water bars. Unfortunately, I didn't win a gold medal, but I met a gold medalist, which is really exciting. And yeah, here today to just share our journey and perhaps some lessons or challenges that might help some of you guys on your journey. Just another reminder, so we've got Menti 61078478 to join along on the poll and the quiz. So just before I start though, I'm sure you're aware climate change is a worldwide issue, and the latest IPCC 2022 report stated that we're likely to see 1.5 degrees of warming in the next 2 decades, and tackling carbon emissions is key to helping to tackle this. And we categorize these emissions into 3 scopes. So we've got scope 1, which is our direct emissions. In the water industry, that's primarily from our operations and processing of wastewater. We've got scope 2. These are all our emissions from the generation of electricity that we purchase to run our operation. And then finally, we've got scope 3, my favourite, which is our indirect emissions from our value chain, both upstream and downstream. Essentially, the things we buy, build, and waste. So, Menti polls at the ready. I'm going to jump in with 2 quick fire questions. So that was menti.com and then 61078478. Oh, I've got some keen beans in already. So just interested to know, like, does your company organisation report Scope 3 emissions? Are you involved? Don't know, and no. So just give you guys a few seconds to vote on that. Okay, so we've got probably about half the people that do, half not sure, and a small percentage that don't, which is interesting. And it's something that we're absolutely all companies are going to be expected to report on more. There are government legislations and laws being written in to reduce our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions by 2035. So we're expecting to see that number of companies that report, and also the number of companies that are being asked to report their emissions increase. Okay, let's just move this on. So next question then, and it'll be in a bit of a quiz format, so you do get points, more points for answering quicker. I know us in the West Midlands branch love a quiz. So hopefully everyone's ready and answers at the ready. So first question, which of the below represents 1 tonne of CO2 the best? Yeah, we've got a bit of a time limit on this one. Oh, yeah, pretty good there. So majority of people correct. So yeah, one person flying from Paris to New York represents 1 ton of carbon dioxide, and it's quite hard to kind of put what a ton of carbon is in perspective. But yeah, useful and interesting to know that that flight or that holiday is essentially 1 ton of carbon. Okie dokie. So just got one more question at this stage. Oh, I've got a leaderboard first, though, of course. So looks like Kathy's topped that one with the fastest finger. Very good. Okay. Okay, so final question at this part. So which scope of emissions is typically largest? Scope 1, 2, or 3? And this is for a typical company. Okay, just got a few more seconds. Okay, got some people going with the majority here, I think. But the correct answer is scope 3. You might be surprised to know on a scope 3 webinar, but yeah, typically for most companies, scope 3 is the largest, and that's because you take into account all of your suppliers' emissions and not just your own. So that's certainly the case for Severn Trent. Okay, so we know what our scopes of emissions are. What I'm just going to share with you now is the journey that Severn Trent went on. Just to help sort of put it into context. So in 2019, Severn Trent launched their Triple Carbon Pledge. This is a commitment to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2030 for our operational business, to have 100% of our electricity generated by renewable sources, and thirdly, that we'd have 100% electric vehicle fleet where available. So that was in 2019, we set that. 2020, we had the pandemic. I like to think of things as sort of pre or post pandemic. It helps me put it into perspective. And just sort of as this pandemic was hitting, we started to realize that we didn't have any targets or commitments that focused on all of our scope 3 emissions, and we wanted to bring those into play. So what we did around that sort of summer and autumn period was we started to understand what these emissions might be at a high level, and sought agreement from our directors to actually set a target, because we recognize that if we set a scope 3 target, that's one of the best ways one of the best tools we can use to reduce it. So we worked on setting our science-based target commitment, which brings in a scope 3 target element, and we were accredited with that in about September 2021. And then since then, we've been setting up work streams to reduce our emissions. But we had a few people on the quiz that don't report it, some that weren't sure, and I suppose from our journey, where did we start? It can seem quite daunting to start. One of the key lessons we had was that actually decisive leadership was really helpful for us at this sort of around 2020, because it gave us sort of the green light. Yeah, we're committed to this, and we could really progress at pace. So I definitely recommend seeking that where possible. Once you've got that top level buy-in, there was sort of 3 key things we did. The second of which were we identified all the sources and started to pull together a baseline. Now, we had a project team to do this that had a really good range of experience from all different parts of the business. And Severn Trent, you know, it did feel daunting. We had over 6,000 employees. We have a huge range of services and operations that we fill, not just waste and water. We do a lot of renewables work. We have Severn Trent services. We even have some leased houses that Severn Trent rent out. So it was quite a big task for us to map out and categorize where all these emissions from our business were. And once we'd done that, we spent some time reviewing them with all our sort of senior leaders across the business to check that we'd captured everything and that, you know, we hadn't left anything because we just weren't aware of it. And there's a couple of challenges with this. So knowing that you've captured all sources, you've never really felt 100% sure initially, because like I said, it was so vast and diverse. And And then another question we had was around how do we know where to draw the line? So in the next slide, I'll share with you the sort of sources and pockets that we found. And it's quite an interesting sort of discussion topic we had around how far back do we go? Water, for example, is used in all parts, in majority of activities, and would count in our downstream. So at what point do we cut off? And there was a couple, I guess, key learning moment for us here, which helped us, which was to check back. Do we have financial control over these emissions, and what level of influence do we have? And that sort of helped us to understand and draw a clear boundary as to what should be in scope and out of scope. But I guess you're interested to know, what do we find when we carried out this? So some of you might be familiar with this map. We've got our scope 1 emissions on the left-hand side, scope 2 sources in the middle column, and on the right-hand side, we've got all of our key scope 3 sources. So scope 3 is typically categorized into 15 categories as per the greenhouse gas protocol. So you need to identify them and put those emissions into one of those 15 categories, which can be quite tricky. Some of the guidance is quite tricky to interpret, and we spent some time understanding that. These categories, though, they can be business travel, so traveling between different meeting venues. We've got even the electricity used to get to your site before you even use it needs to be considered. Customers' energy to heat water, and quite a large source for us is actually all the construction material. Severn Trent have got multi-billion-pound capital construction program, and that's a significant source for us, as is all materials that we purchase. So we have a purchase goods and service category. It can be chemicals, which are quite intensive to source, down to consultancy services, any products we buy, be it PPE, pipe fittings, pumps, even janitorial products and bacteria sort of spray, all needs to factor into that. We've also got, in the bottom right here, we've got biosolids. So as part of the wastewater process, you're left with a cake product. We sell that to some of our farmers, and there's some carbon dioxide released, or some emissions released as part of that process that we need to account for, but also waste. So links quite closely to some of the circular economy principles, but anything we waste, be it in the office, be it on site when we're constructing a capital works, all of that waste needs to be recorded. And then we also found some emissions that you might not expect or might not think of. So I mentioned we had about 50 or 60 leased houses that we needed to account for, and also employee commuting and working from home emissions also factored into that category, which is quite interesting when you think of it. So some of our key sources there. I'm going to jump back to the quiz and see how we're doing. So next question is coming up. Fastest finger first, and we are off. So which of these sources would we report as a scope 3 emission? Quite a long timeline for this, actually. So is it Severn Trent van driving to repair a leak, traveling to an office for a meeting, or energy used to power our sites? Gone for, yeah, majority there. I've gone for 2. So yeah, number 1, if it's one of our vehicles we own that's carrying out one of our processes, such as fixing a leak, we'd actually put that in our scope 1. If it's a non-Severn Trent vehicle, or we're traveling between sites for a meeting, that would be in our scope 3. And the energy used to power sites is scope 2, unless it's the energy that's coming to our the transmission and distribution part of that electricity, which is, it can take a bit to get your head around. Okay, moving on though, we've got to see the leaderboard first. Is Kathy still in the lead? Possibly not. And Kemi's up there. Ollie's still up there. Roisin third. Okay, one more question at this point. Okay, fastest finger. So which of the below is the largest source of emissions for Severn Trent? So is it chemicals, consultancy services, and construction? Time's up. So yeah, so for us, that's actually construction, and I'll share that in a bit more detail in the next slides. Chemicals is a really big one for us, as is consultancy at the moment, because we currently assess it based on spend, and we have quite a large spend associated with that, but construction is by far the biggest. And that's partly because of the way that we source materials. Some of the concrete manufacturing processes are really quite carbon intensive. Okay, we'll just check the leaderboard first. Can Ollie overtake? That is the big question. G's popped onto the leaderboard as well. Okay, Kemi, Roshi, and Ollie slipped down to third. Very good. Okay, we'll pop back to last question in a second. So these were some of our key sources. There were a large list, but essentially, what did we find? So in total, we had about 528,000 tonnes of Scope 3 emissions. And to put that into perspective, that is sort of significantly more than we've currently reporting on our process emissions. Purchased goods and services is particularly large, 220,000 kilotons. If you remember, 1 ton of kiloton was that aeroplane journey from Paris to New York. 220,000 of them is a lot. Also interestingly to pull out here, I think, is around the business travel and employee commuting. So as I start to share some of our Scope 3 ambitions and engage with the rest of our business, I think employee commuting and business travel are great because everyone can relate to them, regardless what role you do. It's been quite an interesting debate because although those sort of percentage-wise, they're quite small in comparison to the other activities, they are great sources to engage people. It's something everyone can contribute to, and ultimately we're going to have to see reduction across all categories of emissions to hit our targets. So yeah, sold products would fall into that sort of that cape to land part for us. Fuel and energy, capital goods, upstream transportation, getting things to our sites. So that's what we found, and I mentioned we set some science-based targets. So this sort of was to complement our triple carbon pledge, and we had on the right-hand side here our Scope 3 targets are in the yellow box. So we set an engagement target, which means that 70% of our suppliers by emissions need to have set their own science-based target equivalent target. It was decided that was the best way for us because it would help us on our engagement journey. We recognise that a lot of our suppliers perhaps weren't as mature on that carbon journey as we were, and this helps us really target the big hitters, engage them on target, and start to get them thinking about how they can reduce their emissions. And we also set a reduction target for the use of sold products as well as that. Okay, so that's what we found. So the next question is, what are we doing about it? And there's three key things that we're focusing on. So the first one is our supplier. So we're engaging with our suppliers to set a reduction target. We've got a project team that sits within the business, and they've been doing loads of work to create engagement packs, how-to guides, training workshops to help our suppliers understand the challenges that we've got and what we need from them. We've set new contract clauses. So this means that when we engage with a new supplier, we're requesting that they set their own target as part of our contracts for work with them. And we're also being more selective about introducing these questions into our sort of PQQ stage or or initial questions when we're selecting a supplier, so that we can make sure we're working with like-minded suppliers. So that's in the supplier space. In the capital space, we're looking at how we design low carbon solutions. We've created a carbon calculator tool, and we've mandated the use of that carbon calculator tool for all our capital projects. This includes any suppliers that we work with that might be involved with the designing stage. And then the third key thing we've done in the capital space is improved our governance and reporting process, so that we can make sure we're being really strict about using the calculator tool, looking at how we consider low carbon solutions, and we've set ourselves a target to reduce these emissions from the outline design stage to the detailed design stage by 30%, just on the design alone. So the third key focus for us is data, and it's a really challenging area, but we're working with our suppliers and teams to collect more data, collect it more regularly, and at a more granular level, which is harder than you think. We've set up a dedicated sort of data improvement program, which has got a whole raft of activity. Something we've done just recently is launched a employee survey to understand better how people commute to work, what type of vehicle they use, how far are they traveling, how often. We're now working in this more hybrid, more working from home period since COVID, and we've seen that change the habits of our employees. It's been all three of these key focus areas have got their challenges. In the supplier space, we're working with a huge range of suppliers. We've got a couple thousand on our books, and it's a huge task to focus on, let alone the nature of the business. We're looking to change our suppliers, and calculating where we are against that target is quite tricky. In the capital space, there's some real big challenges around understanding what materials are better. We need to look at the end-to-end not only do we need to look at what product is perhaps more carbon intensive than another, we need to factor in the cost challenges. Cost of living is obviously a key force at this time as well. But we also need to understand not just what's an affordable low carbon solution, but how long does it last? Do we have to actually replace it more? And when we look at the life cycle of that material, is it actually not as good a choice as something else? And then on the data space, you can imagine it's a huge raft of data that we need to capture, store, ensure that we can do the right controls on and assurance checks, and our methodology on how we calculate emissions in different categories all needs to be fed in like a huge long maths equation, which again is challenging. So the key learning on this point for us really is that, again, it can seem overwhelming. We're focusing on the most material categories first, and I think that has helped us to sort of prioritize and move forward. So thanks very much for listening, and it'd be great to hear if anyone had any questions.
Right, we have some questions from our members. Okay, so I'll just scroll up to the top. So the first one is about consultancy services. How do you balance this in terms of early stage activities, non-construction activities? Does this, broadly speaking, skew the outputs? I suppose there's, consultants have different hourly rates, but that's not necessarily related to their carbon input. So how do you go about consultancy versus other inputs?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a really good point. So when we're using these spend sort of proxies, we might say, right, all of the spend in a consultancy category has this multiplier that will give us a rough estimate, because typically consultancies would produce this much emissions. What we're trying to get to is the actual, or the a consultancy service to tell us what their annual emissions were, because that is a much more accurate way of capturing emissions data for us. So that's why it's really key we move away from the spend-based proxy towards the actuals, and it will remove that sort of issue where you've got different spends for the same amount of work.
Okay, thank you. One from Matt. Do you use embodied carbon? Whoa, lots of questions coming in, so my screen moves. It was about embodied carbon in supplied goods. How do you include energy generation? Oh, sorry, we've got, as I scroll up, we've got more questions coming in as fast as I can try and hold it. Sorry. Right. How do you include energy generation or offsetting carbon? What happens if somebody's producing a widget and they produce hydroelectric, or they have wind turbines in their factory? Is it the net carbon that goes towards it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So to be honest, we haven't had any of those exact examples, but what we would report on if we had those is the embodied carbon, say, of producing, let's just say it's a wind turbine. We would say, understand from the supplier what is the emissions, the scope 3 emissions from producing that embodied carbon, and then we would report separately, say, the electricity generated from that. And I think that there's a new draft GHG guidance which has made it clear that you need to report those different parts of those different components separately.
That's good. Yeah. Sorry. Another good one. Has Severn Trent been looking at reviewing / revising your asset standards to encourage suppliers / designers to provide low carbon solutions?
Yes, most definitely. And I think some of the team are finding it quite challenging. We've got huge standards, or a large volume of those, and that is absolutely something that we're looking to do. We're really keen to hear from suppliers if they've got a new technology or a new product that they think would work really well. So absolutely looking to work with suppliers, even trial some things in a sort of a proof of concept way where possible.
Is the water industry collaborating on low carbon? Other water companies have a long history in this field, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And the likes of Anglian Water have been looking at embodied carbon for quite a while, as have Yorkshire, and we absolutely are. So there's a number of different forums, Water UK. I think what we've found so far from collaborating is that we all kind of, as the rules have evolved, we've all kind of interpreted them perhaps slightly different or understood our certain emissions differently. So I think it's really key that we keep collaborating on the different forums, but we also work to try and get a common understanding and even common terminology of what certain terms mean, so that we can compare sort of apples for apples. But absolutely key, and I mean, interested to collaborate with anyone that has a particular interest, particularly in the scope 3 part for Severn Trent.
Okay, there's a question for Kaz, which we probably already answered, but how are you balancing the challenge of low cost solutions versus low carbon solutions to incentivize your contractors in any way, i.e. KPIs? So are you incentivizing your contractors to go for lower carbon solutions?
Yeah. So that is something that we are looking at how we bring in. There are a number of different complexities to it. We've been looking at concepts such as a carbon tax, or other incentives, pain gain mechanisms, or there's a number of different ways of doing it, and we're just trying to understand what might work well for that. So again, some colleagues I work with would be very interested to talk with any suppliers that have got any ideas on how that would work, but that is definitely something that we're open to discussing further.
You considered Sorry, every time somebody puts in a question, it jumps down. You consider customers using energy to heat water as one of your scope 3 emissions. What's the rationale for that? Is it based on guidance available somewhere?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the greenhouse gas protocol has some guidance in there about what you should include and what you shouldn't, as well as some other definitions, such as on the Water UK site. At the moment, it's felt that where we can have some influence over the emissions, such as perhaps how much water customers use, that therefore we could be looking at bringing that in. But it's like I sort of mentioned or alluded to, it's trying to come up with some clear rules as to where you draw the line, and actually where is our effort best spent, is my personal opinion on that. It's it was tricky, and a lot of sort of discussing and debating went on within our teams, I think, to try and understand where to draw that cutoff.
Right, here's the big chunky question, which moved again every time I talk. So many people put in questions. Concrete and chemicals are two key materials which need to be decarbonised. How are you addressing this at Severn Trent? That's the big one.
Great question. So we have a chemicals program that we're looking at, recently just been stood up, looking at how we reduce our reliance on chemicals, use different products. We are also on the concrete space. We're looking at, working with some other water companies actually on a low carbon concrete sort of matrix. So there are already some concrete products that have a lower carbon alternative. What we need to work through now is understanding where can we take perhaps more risk on the lower carbon concrete product for an asset that's perhaps not quite so critical. We also need to factor in some cost challenges, but one of the key drivers is risk, because these lower carbon concrete products haven't been around as long. They haven't been tested for 10, 20 years, and we need to be confident that it's going to last, because we can't we need to look carefully at that risk.
What is the immediate biggest win that consultants can help you with as a client? It's a good question though, isn't it? I mean, I can see why they ask it, but how can consultants help you in this journey?
So we're doing a lot of work on what are our data systems to capture this data? How do we improve that process? It can be quite manually intensive to collect the different data from different teams, put it through our various sort of emissions factors calculations, and then we need to slice and dice it in different ways for our different targets. So there's probably some stuff to do in that space, but also how do we, I know I'm sure there's products and services out there that we're not aware of that might help, and it's a fastly moving space out there, so it's identifying perhaps suitable products that have been tested or we could adopt.
Have you an idea how AMP delivery will expand scope 3 emissions? And then as my supplementary, of course, you've got a new AMP period coming up. So will the scope 3 be part of that?
Sorry, Jonathan, do you mind just repeating that one?
Yeah. Have you an idea on how AMP delivery will expand scope 3 emissions?
Yeah.
I suppose there's current and there's future AMPs, aren't there?
Yeah. So we're looking at understanding what's in our PR24 program.
Yeah.
Have we got significant works in certain spaces that we know will increase our scope 3? So that's one aspect of it, is understanding. The second part of it is, can we look at, if we had extra money, could we do it in a different way that perhaps wouldn't have such a big impact on? but we're still in that kind of understanding phase. So it's part of what we're trying to do is engage out to these teams, bring them on the carbon journey, give them access to things like a carbon calculator tool so that we can start to estimate what that scope 3 impact might be. And then what we'll also be working on is are there alternatives to deliver the same but at a lower carbon.
The next question was also on PR24. So with respect to move on to the next one from Helen. What has been the most successful activity stroke initiative in delivering a reduction in, it says phase 3 carbon. I think she means scope 3. What's been the most successful activity initiative so far, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. I think I'd definitely say where we've set a target to our business teams or to our suppliers, we have seen a better result as because of that. So be it in the carbon calculator tool space, where we're seeing that sort of 30% reduction from the outline design to detailed design, but also with our suppliers, where we have engaged with them to set a target, and we're currently at about 40%-ish on our way to that target. So we know that those suppliers are going to be thinking about reducing their emissions. So tricky question to answer. I think targets have been really key to helping us move that forward. Right,
another one from Kaz. Have you upskilled your engineering teams in how to consider carbon in the design process? Any lessons learned you can share?
Yes, we've started that. It's an ongoing process. We've launched some trainings, some lunch and learn type activity. Our lessons learned would be factor in any governance changes. So think about how you can embed that change. We found that people want to do it, but actually to ensure that we're getting all of our design population working on it, we needed to put in some like physical controls, such as at governance process, we had a stage review that determined have you filled in the calculator for example, what did it find? So I'd say think about how you're going to embed it, and then build in controls at certain points.
Do you have a link to the new greenhouse gas guidance, please? There's a supplementary to that. Of course, there is government guidance and there's water industry guidance. So, well, first of all, where should a member look for their greenhouse gas guidance, first of all?
Yeah.
Big question.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges that we're finding. So it's probably looking at them all, to be honest, and making sure you're compliant with parts of it. Greenhouse gas protocol is really robust and probably a good starting place. But I would say you need to look at them all, and that's certainly one of the challenges we're finding is the guidance is updating quite quickly and at a quite fast pace, and also there's different measures that we need to make sure we're compliant against all.
Severn Trent put forward their triple pledge, which is about carbon reduction, obviously, but it's kind of from a corporate customer perspective, which is not necessarily the same thing as science or hard-based carbon footprint reduction. So how's that interplay going with your factual data-based carbon footprint reduction and the corporate triple pledge?
Yeah, it's a good observation, and that's why we brought in the science-based targets and made sure that we were accredited with that, to show that we were reducing as per best practice and science-based targets guidelines. So we like I mentioned, we're reviewing both, but the triple carbon pledge came sort of 2019, before some of this guidance had been updated. And what we're finding now is we'd set this 2-3 years ago now. Guidance has moved on since then, which is why we've set further pledges and so on.
Okay, that's another question just come in. Do you think the decision on the organisational boundaries and what to include was one of the most difficult? For example, when it comes to chemical/gases for water treatment, how far back do you take the emissions allocated to that purchase, to production, or to supplier?
Yeah, absolutely was one of the trickier things to consider, and
right, yeah.
well, yeah, best practice is probably to consider the life cycle of those emissions, yeah, where possible.
It's a daisy chain kind of thing. It's just how far back do you go?
So there's a new draft GHG strategy, GHG protocol, which has shared some more guidance on that. So I'd probably point you in that direction as probably a good starting place.
How do you handle the impact of your year-on-year adjustments on your phase 3 reporting methodology that could show your emissions are increasing when they are in fact reducing? Presumably you can't get it all right in your first year of reporting.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So absolutely, we want to be as transparent as possible with our emissions and what we're finding. And one of the things we'll review any significant changes, should we find any in that reporting period. If we're going to change the methodology, or we found some, say, different spend emission factors to use, I think we could consider, I'm just thinking out loud here, what I think we personally might do is think about perhaps reporting what it would have been with the old factors as well as the new factors, to show that to ensure that we're not misleading anyone.
Yes, another good one here. How often will you report / disclose on progress to achieving your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions reductions targets? So what's your reporting period externally?
Yeah, at the moment, externally, annually is what we're working at.
You do report there's an annual report on carbon accounting, isn't there? And there's also the sustainability report.
Yeah,
Severn Trent produces, which is very good.
Yeah, we also do the CDP reporting as well, but they've all got slightly different cycles, and just like our carbon targets.
We've still got a couple of earlier questions which are still there, which I think we probably answered, but how do you include energy generation or offsetting of carbon by sludge to land rather than fertilizer?
Yeah, so at the moment, the guidance is different for different parts of our target. We know that we can't include offsets for the sludge for our science-based targets, say, and we're looking at working up really detailed methodology to demonstrate actual reductions that we're confident about and we can prove for the other aspects.
And again, about PR24, how are you considering carbon emissions water industry in the water industry investment period PR24? We did answer that earlier, but perhaps if you could just address that again.
Yeah, it's absolutely something we're thinking about. We've got a team working on that submission, and we are working with that team to make sure they've got access to the tools to help them calculate it and estimate what impact certain activity might have.
Okay, Sam, well, that's the end of the questions. We've had 15 minutes, so time's nearly up. I'd like to thank Barbara and Cywin for organising this webinar, and Sam in particular, who's actually on holiday at the moment. So thanks a lot, Sam. It's really, really interesting, and we look forward to having another webinar on this in, say, a year's time for a further update on your journey.
Sounds good.
Yours being you and the company. So
yeah. Well, thank you both, and thanks to everyone for attending.